Live from the Washington DC area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. The Israel-Gaza conflict is physically so far away, yet so central to how the world is shaping going forward, and so close to many of our hearts. It's like coming to a crossing point where history, past wounds, past injustices, and past traumas are all culminating in yet another battle. For different people, from different angles, and through different lenses. The global South is taking more and more a stand against the global North, with an increasingly strengthened front condemning Israel's continued attacks on Gaza and calling for a more balanced approach, and of course, listening to both sides. The Muslimic world is uniting more and more against the road Israel is currently choosing. And in the West, yes, here too, voices are shifting from an initial staunch support of Israel, who has every right to defend itself, no question, to where it is going now. Our topic tonight. Welcome on Smart Sustainability. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. We see growing demonstrations in the West in an outcry of the world against Israel's approach to Gaza in these very moments. From Berlin to Paris, people are marching on the street against Israel's, quote, murdering, as it's called, in protests of Palestinian civilians. Several high-ranking Western staff members have resigned recently from their posts, such as Craig Mokhiber, the director of the New York office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights, who quit his job in protest over Israel's bombing of Gaza. In a letter to the UN High Commissioner Volker Turk, Mokhiber cited the West's complicity, quote, in a genocide unfolding before our eyes. He wrote, quote, the current wholesale slaughter of the Palestinian people, rooted in an ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of their decades of their systemic persecution and purging, coupled with explicit statements of intent by leaders in the Israeli government and military, leaves no room for doubt or debate, end quote. State Department official Josh Paul, who was the director of Congressional and Public Affairs for 11 years at the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs, resigned before him. Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, has declined a ceasefire. The situation is dire indeed. There are no easy answers and no rapid conclusions. According to Western press reports, at least 1,400 people were killed, the majority being civilians, in the Hamas attacks, while Israeli bombardments have claimed almost 10,000 lives in Gaza, most of them civilians, according to health authorities in the Hamas-run Palestinian enclave. Now, we're at a point where we have to decide if we, and we meaning humanity in general, continue down the path that we saw so much of in the 20th century, a spiraling of revenge and slaughter, an eye for an eye, blaming each other for pains of the past and pains of the present with a justification of just the past. This is not a way to build a future or going forward for anyone, I think. The question is, how could it be done differently, and how does it really affect people to people? And while we all watch and listen to politicians and news media, it's easy to forget what all of that means for people, for neighbors, for parents, for people who live there. So we would like to hear from those who are actually there with boots on the ground, live their lives day to day, and we start with Israel. Joining me from Tel Aviv is Itai Shalit, a businessman whose son has been drafted to serve in the Israeli army. And it's very late there in Israel. Thanks so much for joining us. Itai, great to have you on. So let's cut straight through the chase, Itai. What's the situation right now? What's happening around you? What is happening every day in this very moment? How are you feeling?
Well, there's a few layers to your question. Currently, the situation is that Israel the IDF, the Israeli Defense Army, is operating in the northern part of the Gaza Strip in an attempt to eliminate the Hamas infrastructure and Hamas main fighting troops. And from the Hamas side, they continue to bombard Israel from south to north, basically more or less up to the Tel Aviv or even northern Tel Aviv on a daily and on an hourly basis. So basically that is the situation. Our troops are in Gaza, they are bombarding us, and at least right now we don't see any ending to that situation.
How does that affect your family life, though? Where are you in all of this with your family, for example, day to day? How does that translate?
Well, luckily for me, or luckily for us as a family, you know, I'll detail it in a second. We live in the Tel Aviv area, which is a bit less affected, not a bit, it's much less affected than the southern area of the country, or the area which surrounds the Gaza Strip. So we get like 2 or 3 missile attacks per day. When we hear the sirens, we run to the shelter, we wait there for like 10 minutes. In most cases, most of the missiles are being intercepted, and in some cases there are falls or there are debris after the interception, and people are being injured, and there is damage being absorbed. And that affects basically our daily life, because we always need to think where is the nearest shelter. If you go now into Google Maps in Tel Aviv, you know, when you go to Google Maps in New York City, you see where the restaurants are, where the cafes are, and if you go to Google Maps in Tel Aviv, you see where the nearest shelter is. So this is something that you need to plan. We need always to listen to see if we hear sirens, or they're bursting in the if we hear the radio, they're bursting when there's a siren, and we need to. And actually, for me personally, twice I had to stop driving and just lay on the ground, wait 10 minutes until the thing is over. So that's the physical effect of it. As a family, I have a 13-year-old child that is not going to school, or like going once a week because there's not enough shelters in the school. So each class goes something like once a week, and the rest are studying remotely. My son is in the army. We have no communication with him. So that is really troublesome, and that's worrisome, and especially for his mother and his sisters, but of course for me as well. And the good thing is that my eldest daughter is not living in Israel currently. She lives abroad. She's a student in Europe, so she doesn't need to undergo that situation on a daily basis, but she is worried all the time. And actually we laugh about it, that when there's a siren, we actually hear from her before we actually hear the sirens.
So if she were in Israel right now, would she have to serve?
Oh yeah, she did serve in the army 2 years, like all women do. She left the army after 2 years. She worked for a year, and then she moved abroad. Had she been now in Israel, she would have been called on reserves.
Now,
like most young people.
So that means you go to work day to day? You actually continue to go to your business?
Yeah. I go to work day to day. Work is obviously slow because the economy suffered significantly. There's like 350,000 people on reserve right now. So these are 350,000 people that are taken off the workforce, off the economy, off the consumption cycles, and of course their spouses or partners as well, and their children. So there's like a significant amount of the economy being pulled out for military purposes. So that affects all of us, even the ones that are older, too old to be called on reserve, and we continue to work, but work has slowed down for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, but for example, groceries and goods you need for day-to-day life, that's all still stable in Israel, right?
That is relatively stable, but there will be an effect because take, for example, the agriculture segment or the sector, the agriculture sector is concentrated on the south of Israel and specifically around the Gaza Strip. They say that something like 75% of the vegetables that we consume are coming from around the Gaza Strip. And these fields are now not being treated, crops are not being harvested, and there will be a shortage of supply in the coming weeks. So now, this is something that is anticipated.
Yeah. Now, you are a business person, of course, and so as a business person, you see probably this a little bit more so than others, but is this being talked about, the potential supply shortages going forward? Is this part of the general narrative?
Unfortunately, by the way, no, because it's too complicated.
That's what I thought, yeah.
It's too complicated. The economical effect or the economy, let's say the war economy is a boring subject. It's not a sexy subject. Not many people understand it, so they try to avoid even thinking about it. But this will come into effect in the next couple of weeks or months because war costs money, and money needs to come from somewhere. So it's not only shortage of supply, it's the entire economical situation that will be affected by this situation, without a doubt.
Yeah. Now, speaking of narrative, Itai, what is the current official narrative, for example, that you hear on Israeli television about the progress that Israel is making, the stand that Israel is taking right now, but also what's happening on the Palestinian side? Is there such a thing? There must be an official narrative. What's the official narrative you hear?
It's not really an official narrative because it's Israel. There's no official narratives here. We all develop our own narratives based on what we see. And the way I see it, the coverage in the Israeli press is, I wouldn't say it's balanced, but they are not hiding anything that is happening in Gaza. So we do see the destruction. We do see what's going on in Gaza, but there are some events that are getting coverage, high coverage in the international press without knowing all the facts. And at least here, and it's not really an issue of the narrative, they are making sure that we are getting the facts. And as far as the IDF information, I completely trust it. And there were a few cases like that. I think there was something about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago that got an entirely wrong coverage in the worldwide. And, eventually even the BBC had to apologize for echoing Hamas narrative instead of checking the facts and understanding that the report was wrong. Now, the main narrative that I have as an Israeli, and it's not necessarily an official narrative, is that the whole thing was imposed on us. And, I mentioned the IDF. IDF stands for Israel Defense Army. It is here to defend the country. It is not to offense anything. And by the way, if you look at the history of the wars in Israel, Israel never started a war. Israel always reacted, and it paid for it. It paid for it in the Yom Kippur War when we could have started and we had some news and we chose not to, and we reacted. And the events that we are currently part of them, that we witnessed them, that you read about them, they were imposed on us. And we actually were under the conception that the situation with Gaza is more or less stable because they are getting the resources to develop the Gaza Strip, resources coming out of Qatar. They are tens of thousands of Gaza citizens were entering Israel on a daily basis, working in Israeli factories, in Israeli fields, in all sorts of sectors. and actually financing the Gaza economy. I don't know if you remember, but there's no Israeli boots on the Gaza ground since 2005. So the whole concept in Israel, and that probably one of the main things that led to the surprise that we had 4 weeks ago, is the fact that as far as we were concerned, and as far as our narrative 4 weeks ago, things were, I wouldn't say there was no peace between us and Gaza, but things were under control, and we thought, and we were made to believe by the other side and by the mediators like Egypt and Qatar, that actually the folks in the team in Gaza is more interested in developing the Gaza Strip and the Gaza economy and the Gaza education system and the civilian lives than to attack Israel. We were not fooled for a second to think that they want peace with us, because if you read the Hamas manifestation, you clearly understand that their mission statement is to eliminate all Jewish and Israeli existence between the sea and the Jordan River, period.
Yeah, I know. Now, hang on a second. A few things that I want to follow up on. So let's go back to the Gaza Strip here for a moment. Some would argue in the West, and I've heard people say that, for example, that in Gaza, it's really more like a ghetto. It's very populated, it's very thin, and it's more like a ghetto. So to say that kind of, they had equal, life was easy for them, I think we all agree that was probably not the case necessarily.
Totally agree.
Okay. So then the other part is, with some would even say, and I have to ask you that because I think a lot of people would question and say, how come actually that this attack could take place in the first place? Because we all were under the assumption, or we were all being told, Mossad sees everything. So the question comes up, how was that possible? Do you believe it was intentionally happening that way or set up this way, or do you really think it was just mistakes happen?
I'm not part of the small team that sees conspiracy here. And unfortunately, Mossad or Shin Bet or the intelligence, and they do not see everything, but you know what? They see most of the things, but seeing is not enough. You need to understand. And when they saw all the signs and all the signals for the attack, including training that simulated exactly what happened, and also hearing Hamas spokespeople telling what they intend to do, and reading in the Hamas manifestation, but we were still tilted everything towards, based on the conception that they chose strategically to spend their efforts internally rather than fighting Israel. And that actually relates to the opening statement of your question, that it's a ghetto and they didn't have the opportunities. And again, it's a highly populated area, probably one of the most populated in the world. But still, they had, since 2005, almost 20 years of international investments, of Israeli investment, that could have been directed towards different avenues that would have led the place, I wouldn't say to be the Singapore of the Middle East like the late Shimon Peres hoped it would be, but had they used the resources and the time to invest in things that you and I would, if we were in their shoes, they would not be in a situation where you perceive them as ghetto, highly populated, with no hope. So, and again, I don't want to sound paternalist, like they had a chance and they decided not to do it. But at the end of the day, it's economy. You get the resources, you get the pie, and you need to decide where you want to use it. And they used 95% of the pie, building military forces that we thought they would never use because it would be against their interest. And guess what? it was in their against their best interest, because you see what's happening in the Gaza Strip right now. But apparently their logic is not our logic.
Now, has your own thinking about the Palestinians, for example, changed in the last 4 weeks? Have you thought of, I mean, when you're in this situation and you're basically surrounded, and you mentioned earlier in a conversation we had that you were 3 years old when the Yom Kippur War happened. You still remember parts of it. So obviously there are things that are kind of triggered also by that. So when you hear that, you must be thinking about some of your own belief systems and thoughts and things like that. Has that changed in some way during the last 4 or 5 weeks?
It did change, and I'm fighting that change. Because, first of all, I don't believe in living without hope. And I think finding a solution, and I wouldn't even call it peace, but finding a way to live side by side is a hope that we should not give up on. Just to go back 4 weeks ago, to put it in a sort of a historical context, we were on the verge of signing a normalization or even a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia. And actually, following Jordan and the Abraham Accords and the very, very old peace with Egypt, we would be in a position to have normalization and peace and side by side with the entire normative Arab world. And when you ask me about my thoughts about the Palestinians, well, I don't see them as one as one piece, as I don't see the Arab world or the Islamic world as one piece. And there's normative part of it, and there is the more radical part of it. And unfortunately, in the Gaza Strip, we are fighting the barbaric part of it. And I'm still trying to distinguish or to differentiate between most of the people in Gaza and most of the people in the West Bank. And I hope that distinction will hold for the future and will maybe serve as a basis for some side-by-side status quo or side-by-side solution, or call it whatever you want. And again, I'm not naive. I don't speak in terms of love and peace. But you know, if you put aside love and if you put aside peace, there's some other ways of coexistence. Unfortunately, with the radical barbaric Islamic part, which is for me is basically manifested in the Hamas and the Gaza Strip population, I don't see any future.
Wow, that's yeah. I mean, now what do you think when you look at your kids? You were 3 years old at the first time when this happened. Your children are now what age are they?
Ella is 13 years old, Shai is 20, and Yael is 23.
So what do you think the impact of an experience like that is going to be on that generation in terms of how to live in any way side by side, basically with an environment or with people around you that basically completely deny your right to exist?
I think, and you know, I wouldn't say I'm surprised, but I am excited to see that it actually toughens the young people and actually makes them more attached to the country, more committed to Israel. And I think that in the long run, experiencing a war, a very, very tough war with lots of casualties and lots of dead young men and not only young, and not to mention the hostages that we didn't mention yet, and perhaps we should touch that in a second. I think the effect would be that they will be even more committed to staying in Israel and to build the country in the way it should be built.
What does it?
At least that's what I hear from them.
Yeah. What does it feel like to actually live in an area that is so, where you're really surrounded by so much hostility by people that literally deny your right to exist? What does that feel like? How is that like?
I think in the last 4 weeks, it started to be a little bit more intimidating than it was before. We never thought about it. It was always in the back of our mind. And we had wars in Israel, and we had a long time without wars, and there was the tension between us and Hezbollah on the north and Hamas on the south, and sometimes in the West Bank, but it was never manifested in such a brutal and barbaric way. So until 4 weeks ago, it was, I guess it was in the back of our mind, but it really wasn't a big part of defining our way, defining the Israeli way of living. And if you did come to Israel 4 weeks ago, even if you do come to Israel now in Tel Aviv, you would see people going out 24 hours a day, working, celebrating, having time, and that's not only in Tel Aviv. So it was never part of what we had in mind. Whether that's going to stay or not, or what the effect of that understanding is going to be, time will tell.
Now, when you look at what's happening around the world, Itai, and also here in the West, and I know I've been in Europe last week, actually in Germany. I've seen some of the demonstrations, the pro-Palestinian demonstrations that were taking place. They had a big one in Berlin with more than 100,000 people. They had a smaller one in Munich with only 5,000 people. But I personally, by just watching this on the sidelines, I was actually extremely shocked as a German native, particularly about some of the chants that we were listening to. So they were literally people, and most of them were younger generations that really don't know much, I guess, even they don't know much about our own history, I suppose, that were literally going through the streets, and they were chanting like, a quotation like murderers of Israel and Israeli slaughters and things like that. It was really terrible. I personally was so shocked. I'm pretty sure most of our age, at least, my generation, that when we were brought up, we always had this saying that this, and not just saying, but really also this understanding that there must be even a particular sensitivity to that subject to begin with. And when I watched all that, I was really unbelievably shocked. I mean, I was so shocked by what I saw there. So when you hear that, and we see those marches and demonstrations in a lot of other cities, we see it in Paris, we see it in London, we see it in Berlin. What is your reaction to all of this? What are your first thoughts around that?
First of all, of course, I'm disappointed, and to a certain extent, I'm even scared. But I'm not surprised because, first of all, I think most people are ignorant as far as history is concerned. And most people watch yesterday's news and they forget about the news from last week. And there's a news cycle, and you're in the media, and there's a news cycle. And 4 weeks ago, what dominated the cycle was the horror or the horrifying images from the massacre, from the slaughter in the Israeli side. And now what basically controls the cycle is the civil destruction in Gaza, and people forget about the causal link between the two things. And there's a lot of ignorance in the understanding of the situation, and that's the thing that, to a certain extent, it disappoints me, but it's not surprised, because we as Israelis, we abandoned the international explanation or propaganda arena long ago, and we gave up on US campuses, and we gave up on European media and European young generation, and we failed to explain what is, at least from our side, from our narrative, is causing the entire situation. And it's easy to watch the news coming from Gaza and to feel for them. As when I watch them, in some cases I do feel for them. I'm a human being. I'm a human being, but I am because most people are not exposed to the facts, but only exposed to the images. They react to the images, but since they don't know the facts, they cannot develop the judgment, which I believe is the right judgment to the situation. And don't get me wrong, I'm not in favor of civilians suffering. I'm not in favor of mass destruction. But since I know the facts better than most people in Europe, and we fail to explain them, then we fail to explain that every building that's being targeted in the Gaza Strip is being targeted because it is hosting Hamas infrastructure. And there's videos that sometimes the IDF releases of missiles being fired from mosques, missiles being fired from schools, missiles being fired from hospitals. By the way, according to international law, if you fire a missile from school, that's a crime war. And everybody's talking about crime wars from one side. And by the way, we do not and we do not bombard these schools, even though, to the best of my knowledge, because these schools host missiles, according to the international laws, we can fire back at them, and we choose not to. So each target is carefully being examined with a lot of intelligence and legal teams to approve it. And we fail to explain that and to show that, and people do not understand that, do not know that, and hence they only develop their judgment based on sporadic images that are being sent out, which in many, many cases are out of context.
Now, you mentioned earlier, Itai, that you trust the IDF, but you don't trust, what was it, the Western media. The interesting part I find is that many people actually in the West don't trust any of the government institution or the military institutions for that purpose. Why would you actually trust the IDF?
Because the IDF is one of the establishments or the organizations in Israel which is in consensus, and its consensus is built on the fact that when it gives information, and it doesn't always give the information, when it gives information, it gives accurate information.
How do you know that?
First of all, you have to remember that our boys are there. They cannot tell us something that is not true, and we will not find out that it's not true in 5 minutes. It's our children there. So it's a very, very small country. And by the way, because it's a small country, there's no one family in Israel which doesn't know someone who got injured or kidnapped or died 4 weeks ago. I know people. I know 3 people that died, actually, neighbors. So we trust the IDF because we served in the IDF, because our children serve in the IDF. When the IDF tells something that is not true, we will know that in 5 minutes, and they know we will know that. So they have a reputation of communicating accurate, verified information, and in the cases where they do make mistakes, they don't make them on purpose, and they correct them. So this is an establishment that I trust. And by the way, it's not that I don't trust international media. I'm just saying that.
But nobody else does. Nobody else trusts international media. In fact, nobody else trusts any of the media.
But you know, you're in media. you don't have time to check. So
I
at
try
the
to
end of
check.
no, I'm not saying you, but the newsrooms don't
Yeah.
have time to check. They get information if it makes sense to them. If it's
Yeah.
coherent story, they publish it. Basically, like our mind works. If the story is coherent, we believe in it, and then we suppress any alternative explanations. We don't spend. We're too lazy to check, and we don't have time for it.
Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu says no ceasefire until victory. But what is victory, Itai?
That's a very good question, and when I'm talking to friends of mine, I'm always asking it. I think it's a Prime Minister Netanyahu is very populist, and I think the term victory was true decades ago when you had two armies fighting against each other. It's like when you're fighting someone in the kindergarten, and whoever stands at the end wins. Here, there's no army, so I have no idea how to define victory. I think I'm not sure Prime Minister Netanyahu knows how to define victory. I think we will reach a certain situation where we feel a bit more comfortable with the damage caused to Hamas infrastructure and Hamas armed forces. And if the kibbutzes and the villages and the cities feel comfortable getting back and restart their lives and rebuilding their ruined communities, perhaps that would be a victory. But military-wise, I have no idea what victory is.
Now, from where you stand personally right now, Itai, how do you think this war could end? What could be an outcome of it?
Ideally.
Realistically. Let's talk about ideally and then realistically, feasibly.
Realistically, I think there are chances of eliminating Hamas as I'm looking for the term. First of all, as a military force that controls the Gaza Strip, but also as a governmental force controlling the Gaza Strip. And perhaps, when you look at the signs of Free Gaza, perhaps the term is trying to free Gaza from Hamas without being paternalist, and giving the population there the chance to experience a different kind of regime. And I'm definitely not relating to an Israeli regime because that's not going to happen. But realistically, if the Palestinian Authority, with the aid of international forces, including the normative Arab partners, take control over the Gaza Strip and try to develop them some sort of a regime similar to what's happening in the West Bank, that coexists next to Israel and cooperates sometimes with Israel and fights with Israel, not military-wise, but argues with Israel and trying to obtain more. Perhaps that's a way to end the situation, or to bring it back to a coexistence situation where both sides give up on something and gain something, which is, as we all learned, probably the way an argument should end.
Yeah. Now, when you think about going forward potentially, could you see a two-state solution?
It's a tough question. Most Israelis, if you run a poll in Israel 5 years ago, most Israelis would vote yes. Right now, I think most of us would vote no.
Why?
Well, there's a say that the maximum that Israeli governments, and not necessarily Netanyahu or not Netanyahu, are willing to offer is far from the minimum the Palestinians are willing to accept. It will only happen if there's a Palestinian leadership similar to the Israeli leadership that we had in 48, that is willing to say yes to something and build on it. And that's what we did. And maybe I don't see that in the very, very near future. Maybe with time, maybe with the right processes of coexistence, such leadership can come to existence. But without such leadership, with the existing leadership of the Palestinians, we'll need to find coexistence process or coexistence formula, which is not necessarily a two-state solution.
Wow, that's going to be really hard, because when you talk about coexistence and you come out of a conflict that is so deep and so violent and so brutal, for example, talking about coexistence to some degree, I really don't know how that could happen without either both parties maybe being so bullied into submission to some degree that they actually have to come to an agreement. I think that's going to be really, really difficult. I just can't see how that would work. What do people think in Israel? Like, what do your neighbors think? You know?
Most of the people that I speak to think like me, or even a more radical, in the sense that there's no solution in the foreseeable future. I think that as far as Gaza Strip and Hamas, there's not going to be any coexistence. They will, as long as they control the Gaza Strip, nothing's going to be there. Only death to both sides. Once Hamas is eliminated, and once there's a more pragmatic and normative force in control of the Gaza Strip, then I think most Israelis at the end of the day would be willing to give up a lot in order to have normal lives, but they will be less willing to give up on any defense needs that we believe are necessary to make sure that we are not ending up in a situation like we had 4 weeks ago. And that's something that perhaps would be, most of the Israelis are now much tougher than they were 4 weeks ago.
Oh, I believe it. Now, we talked a little bit about leadership. Let's talk a little bit about leadership here for a moment. Now, you mentioned before that if the Palestinian leadership had the right kind of leadership, what could that be? What would that be that would inspire sort of trust among Israelis, for example, for a type of leadership where you said we could actually start negotiating something?
First of all, I think that it should be an authentic leadership coming from the local population, not from the old Tunis team of Arafat and Abu Mazen. It should be a more it's difficult for me to define the leadership of the other side.
I know, but like I'm getting to the Israeli leadership in a moment. I'm just trying to figure out. So what would be like key components you would like to see so that, for example, you would be able to trust the leadership on the other side?
Well, it's basically if we see leaders that are talking more about the future rather than about the past, then I think, at least personally, I'll be more willing to believe in it. But as long as they are stuck in the past, and as long as they say no to everything, and as long as, I'm looking for a leader that will say, I'll take whatever I can get and make the most of it, like we did in 48. In 2000, and I think, don't get me on the year 2006, I think, when Olmert was prime minister before Netanyahu, he offered Abu Mazen basically something like 90% of the territories back, and the rest of the missing 10%, he offered territory swap So basically, they would get 100% or close to 100% of the area that was occupied in '67, and they will declare a Palestinian state of that area. And he never got back to him. So I'm looking for a leader from the other side that will say, give me what Olmert gave us, give us whatever you think, not whatever you think, but, whatever you think you can build a consensus around, and we build on that. And we'll define some gray areas that we will delay the discussion on them. Jerusalem, for example.
Now let's switch here for a moment and go to the Israeli leadership. Do you see, can you see under Prime Minister Netanyahu a way forward? Would you also like to see a different kind of leadership?
Here I'm a little bit biased because for 15 years, I've been thinking Netanyahu was never a leader. And you know what? If you ask me, what do I want from an Israeli leader, and that would probably apply for a Palestinian leader as well. I would like to see someone that I'm convinced 100% that he is working for the people and not for his coalition and not for himself and not for his base. And that's been the problem with Netanyahu for years. So to your question, no, under Netanyahu as a leader, and again, I think Netanyahu and leadership is a contradiction in terms. Under Netanyahu, I don't think there's any way Israel can come out of this situation stronger from economical standpoint, from security standpoint, and from internal affairs standpoint. So I think Netanyahu should step away, probably too many years too late, and let someone else fix all the things he managed to mess up in the last years.
Are you pretty confident? I mean, you talk to other people too. Is this sort of like a consensus that's shared among other people as well, or is this more your very personal point of view in where you're at right now?
At this point in time, I think it's a consensus because of the situation we met 4 weeks ago, because of the huge trauma. But traumas go away and people tend to go back to base. So I'm afraid that the longer it takes, more and more people will go back to base, and Netanyahu is.
But traumas never go away. They just stay until they get triggered the next time.
Yeah. And Netanyahu is working while people are fighting. He is working in order to build his future claim that basically whatever happened 4 weeks ago, although happened on his shift, was not his fault, and he's the person to correct it and to make sure it doesn't happen again. Hopefully, there won't be too many people that would take that narrative and go forward with it. Right now, there's a consensus that Netanyahu has to go away, and if there are elections now, the polls are giving his coalition probably 40% less than they have now.
Now let's talk future here for a moment, Itai. When we talk future, what is a future you would like to see for Israel? Where is the country going? How would it tie into the whole area there that you're geographically?
I'd like to see the country with a modern leadership that takes into account the balance needed from a country, or let's say the contract the country needs to have with its citizens, covering all areas of life, from education, from health system, from social system, and of course from defense standpoint, and trying to find a way to live in that area and to position itself as the, let's say, as the pinpoint of the Western civilization, because actually what happened 4 weeks ago was not a war between Israel and Palestine, not even a war between Israel and Gaza Strip. It was a clash of civilization. It was a clash of the Western or the normative civilization, and Israel is at the tip of it because it's positioned geographically here. But in that sense, it was a war between your civilization and my civilization against the civilization of, I wouldn't even want to relate it to Islam, because it's not necessarily related to Islam. It was a civilization, a negative civilization, a civilization whose only mission statement is to fight against the Western civilization. And you're German by origin and you're American, but always remember, and this is something that we always fail to explain, that for Hamas, for Iran, for the radical Islam, Israel is the small Satan. You're the big one. And guess who they want to go for after the small one? The big one. So the future is, we need to find our way, both international wise as part of the Western civilization, and try and get the Western civilization to understand our role in it and our position in it, and find allies in the normative allies in the area that could be part of our civilization, and that's the future I want for the country.
But somehow we have to take into account the healing process that it takes for all the colonialization and all these other old ways of thinking at times that I think most of our parents and grandparents, well, I'm a German, so I certainly speak from that particularly, sort of had to deal with. At some point we have to come to a healing in this whole clash of civilization, and also with all the burdens from the past. So to me, I think the way it relates is really there's a lot of world trauma, and we somehow have to overcome that in order to move forward. So if we always go down the revenge thing, like they did this then and they did this then at that point, and we always focus on the past, and that's, I think, what you were referring to as well, then we can never get out of the spiral that keeps coming up and basically really pitting people against people.
Obviously, I agree with you, but again, we have to understand who are the people we can heal. I don't think with Hamas there's any healing process. Hamas have a mission. It's written in their manifestation. It's written in their manifestation that they would like to eliminate Israel, and they can use women and children for that sense, and they can kill women and children for that sense. And they got from Sheikh Kardawi years ago a religious ruling saying that they can kill women and children because women serve in the army and children will serve in the army, and hence all of them are considered soldiers, and you can kill soldiers. So with them there's no healing. But I totally agree with you. And if we're going back and you're mentioning your, because you're German, I would love to have a Marshall Plan for the Gaza Strip, but there would not have been a Marshall Plan for Germany had the Nazi Party stayed in power. There was a Marshall Plan for the German people. There should be a Marshall Plan.
Because Germany was completely in rubble.
Exactly.
That's why.
Exactly. So there should be, I would love to see a Marshall Plan for the Gaza people, but without their leadership, the Hamas leadership.
What do your children want for a future? Do you sometimes talk about that?
I think they share my views on leadership and on the way Israel should go. We had like 10 months of rallies every Saturday, and I was rallying every Saturday against the government and against the changes they were trying to apply. And I was fighting for the future of the country. Let's say they share my anticipation for the future.
Now, when you say you were actually rallying on the street for the change
Yes.
of the country, like what changes are you referring to?
In January, the new government, the existing Netanyahu government, initiated significant changes to the legal system in Israel. Changes that are actually undermining the power and the independence of the legal system in Israel. And as in Israel, we have the government and the parliament are basically the same thing, and the government controls the parliament, then the only other power we have in order to protect rights was the legal system, and we were fighting against significant changes that would eventually, if passed, provide the government with the control of the legal system and hence making the government basically a superpower.
Any final thoughts you want to share with our viewers?
I understand the news cycle, and I understand the images that are dominating the media now, images coming out of Gaza. When you see there's a war between us and Hamas, and in war, innocent people die. And there will be images like that in Gaza, and there will be additional images like that coming from Israel. You will not see images in Gaza of children being slaughtered. You will not see images in Gaza of people, of women and children being burnt alive. You will not see in Gaza images of pregnant women being cut and their feathers taken out before they slaughter them. This is not something you will see in Gaza, and these were images that actually symbolized, at least to me, the fact that it's not about freeing Gaza, it's not about freeing Palestine, it's a civilization clash. And our civilization and your civilization is the same. But if you want to understand the real situation, you cannot give up. You should not give up on trying to dig deeper and collecting all the facts and understanding the causal links between what's happening now and what happened 4 weeks ago and 20 years ago.
Thank you so much for coming on, Itai. Great to have you. For you, of course, our viewers, thank you so much for watching. And I do hope you got some food for thought, and you see actually that nothing really is simple nowadays. It's very much interconnected and complex, and you do need to do a little more research, and self-thinking, as always, is the main thing. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week. Have a good night.